So I want to welcome you to our last forum for the whole year. Can you imagine that? Here we are. And so I'm thankful that you're with us today. And please make sure that if you're on screen, just mute, you'll be muted. But if you have a question, you can raise your hand. There'll be a time for question response after the presentation. So thank you for being with us this morning.
Is it better if I sit or stand, Caitlin? I'm going to introduce Jim.
Oh, whatever you want.
Okay. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jim Brandt. We're so glad to have him. It's such a blessing to have him back on campus with us and presenting today. Dr. Brandt is the now retired professor of historical theology, served on the faculty for 33 years, retired recently.
3 years ago.
3 years ago? Oh. And it's just such a blessing to have you back, my friend and colleague. He's known as an expert in Schleiermacher, which those who, but lately he's been kind of into Christian nationalism.
Well,
He's been researching and thinking and leading workshops and doing teaching around the metro area on us understanding both what's happening now, but also how this has developed over time. Is that better?
That's good.
Okay. Welcome, Dr. Brandt.
Thank you. It is such a deep pleasure to be with you, to talk about something I've been working on. St. Paul still feels like family to me. It's like coming home to be with you and to do what I do, which is try to teach. So we're gonna focus on white Christian nationalism. About a year ago, Esther area came to me and said, would you do a presentation on Christian nationalism, I think she said, and then I said, sure, I can do that. So I did that, and then I kept getting invited to different churches. And I did the presentation for the Sojourners community up in Atchison. And then they said, well, some of our people didn't get to hear you, so we'll come back and do it again. So I was kind of surprised because this isn't really, Sojourners works on spirituality. This really isn't about spirituality, but I think it's really important. So it's been interesting to do that, and I've, each time I've been able to add a little more. So, yeah, so I will share the latest version with you. Okay, you can go ahead. So what is white Christian nationalism? It really is an all-encompassing worldview that people have, and it's for most of the people who would identify it this way, it's part of their identity. It's really deep in them, and so that provides particular challenges, because it's one thing to be in conversation and ask questions about a set of beliefs, but if it goes to a person's identity, that's really different. So what does Christian nationalism do? It idealizes and advocates for a fusion of a certain brand of Christianity and American civic life. Okay, next slide. So one of the people two people who did an important early study on Christian nationalism did this survey of 16,000 respondents, and the questions there are on the left. Federal government should declare the U.S. Christian nation, should advocate for Christian values, should enforce separation of church and state. So all those things. And notice, of the respondents, 52% agreed with all or most of those statements. And 80% of white evangelical Protestants agree. So Whitehead and Perry talk about ambassadors who agree with all of the statements, and then accommodationists who lean toward agreement. They probably don't agree with everything, but so this is really much more widespread. And I think the other thing I want to say as kind of a way of introduction was, I hadn't really, I mean, my whole career, I taught about racism. I taught about the original sins of the United States in terms of what we've done to Native Americans and what we've done to African Americans. But I didn't, so much of this was new to me a year ago. It wasn't on my radar, which is part of the problem. Okay, next slide. And so scholars sometimes talk about a deep story of white Christian nationalism that that the U.S. was founded as a Christian nation on Christian principles, that the U.S. is blessed by God. That's why we've had the success we've had. And then we have a special role to play. And very important for Christian nationalists, these blessings are threatened by un-American forces within and without. Next slide. So their story is very much a story of heroes and villains, people that they lift up, and people that are the bad guys, you know, racial, religious, and cultural outsiders are the them. And there's this deep sense of grievance because there's this sense that, especially in the last 50 years or so, white Christians have been pushed to the margins. That's the way they feel. And so that sense of grievance is something that Trump was really able to appeal to, and got a lot of support because of that. Next slide. Other important book is by Gorski and Perry, and they do a kind of deep analysis and look at the history behind white Christian nationalism, and they talk about this unholy trinity of freedom, order, and violence. That this notion of freedom, it's a very libertarian view. It's freedom from restrictions, especially by the government. So there's a lot of resentment when restrictions are placed. And so the pushback that happened during COVID around mask wearing or social distancing or not meeting, that's a prime example of its response to
unknown caller.
oh my goodness. Sorry about that. Everybody, mute your phones, please. So freedom, this particular notion of freedom is really important to them. And this sense of order, which is a very hierarchical sense of order. And that's kind of central to this vision of white Christian nationalism. And there is a place for violence. Right. When they have to defend freedom or order. And so the January 6th violence can be justified in their eyes because it's trying to defend freedom and order. The violence, you know, there wasn't that much of it, but the violence that happened with the BLM movement, that they would totally condemn, right? Because it's not on the right side. So there's this kind of, sometimes they advocate for violence and other times not, reject it. Okay, next slide. They also, the element of distrust is really important. They distrust experts. And so, you know, Fauci has come under such great attack, and they distrust the mainstream media. They have their own media that they trust, and they have deep trust in Donald Trump. But, next slide. There's also, and this is the thing that Gorski and Perry are really helpful, lifting up, that it's more than just, kind of a Christian vision, but for them, it's deeply commitment to free market capitalism and to rugged individualism. So it's really interesting when they did these research projects and did surveys, they found that really they weren't so concerned about the threat from Muslims or atheists. And if it's really Christian, you think, well, that's what they're worried about, right? I mean, this form of Christian. But no, it's more free market capitalism. So socialism or any form of collectivism,
Right.
is really problematic to them. And so they want to look at the individual. They, that myth of the individual lifting themselves up by their bootstraps. They want to look at the individual, but they don't want to look at structures.
Right.
And they're very opposed to notions of social justice. That's an evil thing for them, right? Okay, next slide. So, white Christian nationalism, I want to talk about the theological grounding for it in fundamentalism, but also dominionism, which is a very conservative theological position that's developed in the last 50 years or so. Yeah, and again, Gorski and Perry, in some of their history, which I haven't included here, they lift up earlier versions of white Christian nationalism. Kind of the roots are really in the Puritans, because the Puritans wanted to set up a Christian nation where everybody had to conform to their beliefs, but they weren't. So fundamentalism is the most recent theological grounding, but it's not the kind of original one. Okay, next slide. So I want to think, kind of my historical work. I wanted to think about white Christian nationalism in the context of modernity, and I want to talk about two kind of views of what's modern. So one way of thinking about the modern world is to say that it arose with the Enlightenment in this period of 1648 to 1799, which is the way I have thought about it typically. Okay, next slide. So the Enlightenment, if the Enlightenment is the beginning of the modern world, then white Christian nationalism as we have it today is definitely anti-modern, because they're opposed to reason, critical thought, modern science, those things, and also opposed to this trajectory that comes out of the Enlightenment with an emphasis on freedom and equality. So that's kind of really important social vision that comes out of the Enlightenment. And I want to talk about it as a trajectory, next slide, because in the beginning, no, that's not yet. So let me, can we go back a slide? I want to talk about a trajectory that emphasizes freedom and equality, because in the early Enlightenment period, right, freedom and equality was thought of as appropriate for white men of property, right? But I would argue that trajectory has expanded over time. So now we see it much more broadly. In fact, would argue that we should, all people deserve freedom and equality. Okay, next slide. So another way of thinking about modernity and when the modern world happens, that some scholars argue for, is that it happens with Western colonialism. That's really the modern world. And so the Western conquest of Africa, the Americas, and Asia by Western powers, that was often driven by this belief in the absolute truth of Christianity and the superiority of Western civilization, right? So that's another way to think about the origins of the modern world. Next slide. And if we think about modernity in that way, then white Christian nationalism is very modern, because they pick up that kind of colonial mindset and that drive to be in control and to impose this certain vision of Christianity. Okay, and clearly, the notion of the superiority of white men, is a key piece of white Christian nationalism. Okay, next slide. So just quickly on the Enlightenment, I had to do this. The Enlightenment is one way to think about it is a response to the Reformation period. And the period of the Reformations, we have, the Western Church is divided. It's not all Catholic anymore. There are these different versions of Protestantism. But one thing those of you who've had me know that I always say the Reformation was not about religious toleration. There were one little voice for religious toleration in the Reformation, but no. Because each tradition thought it was the one true church. And so there's a lot of religious tension, a lot of religious conflict, and that gave rise also to religious warfare. In the Netherlands and France and England, especially in Germany with the 30 Years' War. So the Enlightenment reacts against that to some degree. And the Enlightenment is more about religious toleration. And so, John Wesley is an Enlightenment figure. And his view of Christianity is much more open to those Christians who don't subscribe to him totally. He could even get along with Whitefield and his Calvinist predestinationism, even though he didn't like it. Okay. Okay, so the Enlightenment is also about the ascendancy of reason and critical thought. So this is the birth of modern science. So the importance of proof and evidence. And they also thought they could find universal truths that were true everywhere, and kind of on the mathematical model, right? In math, we can identify truths that seem to have universal application. And that's their kind of model for all truth. And importantly, the Enlightenment gives birth to modern science and to modern political theory, especially lifting up the rights of individuals. Okay, next slide. So modern political movements are born, and they culminate in the French Revolution and the US Revolution. And so we can see those two as the culmination and triumph for these really important social forces: reason, freedom, rights of the individual, equality of persons, at least white property men, right? So that's a really important development and turning point, and kind of the foundation for what we in the US have tended to take for granted. This is who we are. Next slide. Okay. So yeah, here's my thing about the trajectory, right? So freedom and rights and equality has expanded over time to include, much more, many more people beyond white property men. And, to lift up the abolition movement of the 19th century, the civil rights movement of the 20th century, and then other movements that have fought for rights and equality for other groups of people. Okay, next slide. The great hero of the age of enlightenment is Newton, because he discovers these universal laws of physics. Calculus is developed. All of us who got to suffer through calculus in high school or college can blame it on the Enlightenment. There's also, but Enlightenment thinking is also deeply religious. It's a slightly different kind of religion that we'll talk about, but there are a few atheists, Thomas Paine, but not many in this period. Next slide. So we get the development of what we talk about as rational religion or deism in this period. It's not based on revelation, as Christianity is, but it's based on reason. So if we use our reason, we can discover these key religious truths. And so here's the creed of deism. There's a supreme being who should be worshipped. If you run into supreme being language, you found a deist, right? And that moral living is the chief form of worship. That's all that God wants from us, is to live morally, to live in a good way. Good will be rewarded, evil will be punished. And if there's spirituality at all, it's spirituality from your nose up, right? It doesn't impact your body. So it's, these guys, and mostly guys, are in their heads. So very critical of God's supernatural intervention in the world. So kind of the whole biblical worldview with this notion of supernatural intervention is, they're deeply critical of that. They're deeply critical of mystery. They don't have much place for it. Sacraments or priests, no, that doesn't work for the deists. Okay, next slide. So basic support for religion is the argument for design, right? The world exhibits design. It's orderly, it works, it follows certain rules. So there must be someone who designed the world, created the world. Okay, next slide. So one of the reasons that this little excursus on deism is that founding fathers, these three in particular, were deeply influenced by deism, right? And it's important to lift that up because in revisionist white Christian nationalist history, they argue that the country was founded by Christians as a Christian nation. And, deism is an offshoot of Christianity, but it doesn't fit with traditional Orthodox Christianity. It's just not that. So it's important to lift that up historically. Next slide. Okay, so you knew I had to find a way to work Schleiermacher. So part of what happens in the 18th century is, in the theological world, there's this conflict between Orthodoxy with its supernaturalistic view that God intervenes supernaturally in the world, as we find in the biblical witness. But on the other hand, we have these rationalists, these deists, who say, no, that doesn't fit. And the world is reasonable and our religion needs to be reasonable, and so we can't allow for that. So there's this deep conflict. And this kind of third alternative develops with Schleiermacher and Hegel that proposes a kind of third alternative. that has some connection with critical reason of enlightenment, but also connection with more traditional Christian views. So the next slide is, I should have worn my Schleiermacher sweatshirt.
Yes.
So what we have in Schleiermacher and people that follow him, he's really considered the founder of modern Protestant theology because he sets the terms for finding a way to think about Christianity, which can coexist with a modern worldview. And so he understands creation differently in terms of a sense of dependence that we have. He understands redemption differently, with a focus on the life of Jesus, that Jesus saves by his life, by drawing us into a new and higher communion with God. Okay. And very importantly, faith and theology for him are about life in this world. That's what theology needs to think about. How do we live in this world? And so it's not focused on otherworldliness. It's not focused on, getting to heaven, but it's focused on life in this world. Okay, next slide. So important figure in US liberal theology would be Rauschenbusch, who's the leader of the social gospel movement. And so he's influenced by Schleiermacher and picks up some things from Schleiermacher. But he wants to focus on the life of Jesus as well, but he wants to focus on Jesus inaugurating the reign of God. And so he wants to talk about the social character of Christianity and the need for Christians to be involved in the social arena. So the social gospel. And just an aside here, I think Rauschenbusch is, he's a great hero of mine because he has this value of social Christianity, which is really important. He's far, far from perfect. He doesn't do well on the issue of race. So that's real, but I think that's important for us to think about because we have people that we can identify with, but they also fall short in certain ways. Okay, next slide. Okay, so finally to fundamentalism. So fundamentalism is a reaction against this development of liberal theology in the 19th century. And so we get this publication of a series of pamphlets called The Fundamentals. And fundamentalism is a modern movement. They don't like to see themselves that way. We're just doing what was always believed, but it's not true. It's a reaction against modern or liberal Protestant theology. And so these are their key issues: the inerrancy of Scripture, deity and literal virgin birth of Christ, penal substitution of the theory of the atonement, resurrection, and imminent coming of Christ. Okay. And the original fundamentalists were quite militant. They wanted to impose their views and they would not compromise. Next slide. So it was, kind of got a lot of national attention and press. Harry Emerson Fosdick, important liberal Baptist preacher, made the cover of Time magazine. Next slide. So then the Scopes trial happens, and 1927, Donald Dayton is a teacher in Tennessee, and he's teaching evolution, which is prohibited by state law. And so he is brought on trial. And William Jennings Bryan is the part of the prosecution. And it's considered the monkey trial, right? And even though they win the trial, William Jennings Bryan takes the stand, which is a big mistake. And Clarence Darrow makes him make all kinds of concessions and just look kind of dumb. So even though they win the trial, fundamentalism really loses face. And one of the important things was the trial was broadcast on WGN radio. So it got a huge, I mean, it was, people were aware of it. And so fundamentalism really loses face. Okay, next. So I just had to say a thing about William Jennings Bryan, right? I mean, he is a fundamentalist regarding the Bible, but he was also the 3-time Democratic candidate for president, and there were Southern Democrats who were known as the Bourbon Democrats at this time. He was not a Bourbon Democrat. He was a Northern progressive Democrat, right? And in 1896, he loses to McKinley, who is Trump's hero, right? Because McKinley brings in tariffs and McKinley increases the wealth gap, right? But Bryan was the great commoner, and he opposed free market capitalism, and he was critical of US militarism and colonialism. And this is the time when US colonialism and imperialism is really on the rise after the Spanish-American War. Okay, so I just had, it's another one of those figures. There's some things I really disagree about with him, but I also, there's things to admire about William Jennings. Okay, so next slide. Fundamentalism has lost face because of the Scopes trial, but it reemerges in the 1940s and 50s. And it rebrands itself. They don't call themselves fundamentalists anymore. They call themselves evangelicals, which is a kind of milder term, right? And they get organized, the National Association of Evangelicals, and then Billy Graham becomes the face of it. And Billy Graham he is an evangelical, he's a fundamentalist, but he doesn't have the hard edge to it. We'll see in a couple minutes that, one of the issues becomes abortion, and Billy Graham is approached about supporting the anti-abortion campaign. He says, no, I won't do it. And his rationale was, at one of my crusades, there might be a woman in the crowd who's had an abortion. And I don't want to prevent her from coming to Christ because of my stand on abortion.
Interesting.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting? Next slide. Okay, so in the 70s, and especially in the 80s and following, evangelicals are going to become a political force, and white Christian nationalism is going to emerge as a powerful. Now, interesting, 1978, half of all evangelicals are Democrats. The majority of evangelicals voted for Jimmy Carter in 1976. By the time of Trump, 81% of evangelicals voted for him. So this is a massive shift, right? From evangelicals being Democrats to evangelicals being MAGA people. So the question is, how do we account for that? Next slide. Kind of 3 theories that really, I think they overlap, but so the first theory is the rise of the televangelist. The second theory is racism, and the third theory is the marriage of money, religion, and okay. Next slide. So the rise of the televangelists in the 70s and 80s, the thing about fundamentalists, they've always been savvy about technology. So they got on TV and they gained enormous influence, right? And gained wealth and developed a network of supporters, which is going to be really important. Next slide. So part of the new focus on morality, in earlier evangelicals, early 20th century, evangelicals, fundamentalists tended to think of politics as dirty. And so we shouldn't be involved. And so that's going to shift here. And the moral majority is a good indication of that kind of shift. So they're going to come along and they're going to lift up these divisive issues: abortion, homosexuality, school prayer, public morality, role of women in church and society. Those are their big issues on the surface. Next slide. We also get the development of what's called dominionism. And I have to confess, a year ago I did not know what dominionism was. But dominionism is a theological idea that folds into white Christian nationalism. And their basic idea is Christians are called to take over the US. And they were commanded by God and the Bible to do this. And the key figure there is Francis Schaeffer, with his Christian Manifesto of 1981.
Dr. Ray, how much of this is a holdover from like Manifest Destiny? And how much of this is
It picks up on that, yeah. That's exactly right. And that would be, the earlier form would be Manifest Destiny, with this sense of, yeah, we're called to take over as much of North America as we can get our hands on. Right, and Trump wants to get his hands on the rest of North America. Yeah, so that's a good point. Okay. Next slide. And so 7 mountains dominion, right? It's so-called 7 mountains: family, religion, education, media, arts and entertainment, business and government. And so dominionist Christians are working to take over all those areas, but in the meantime, what they've done, really smart, they've developed their own alternative versions of those.
Right.
So they have their own media, they have their own arts and entertainment, they have business, ways of working together in business. So, I mean, they've been really smart about the way they've gone about a lot of things. Next slide. And then Robertson, he's the one who brings dominionism into the public as he runs for president, right? And lays out this vision of making a Christian America. Next slide. As I said, savvy about media and communications. And so, right, in the early days, this is before we used computers, but they developed mailing lists. And the moral majority spent $6 million on direct mail for the 1980 election. Right? So again, savvy. And by 2020, they have massive databases with all kinds of information about people. So they might have in their database that a certain person has a mental health issue. Well, they will micro-target that person with information that might play on their mental health issues. I mean, brilliant.
Can I point something out?
Yeah.
I really appreciate that you're bringing out the points of like savviness and intelligence, because there are so many times that this is discounted by saying like it's insane or it's
They're so stupid.
crazy or stupid, and that is absolutely missing the mark. That's right. So I just really appreciate that.
Yeah. Next slide. I really love David Brooks. I just had to put this in here. Because he went to a fundamentalist church at summer here in the Midwest last November. And his report was people were really pleasant and welcoming, and then the pastor was just full of condemnation. Just had to put that. Next slide. Okay, so the second theory is that the key factor in white Christian nationalism is racism. So the moral majority had claims that abortion is their driving issue. And Randall Ballmer has written this book, Bad Faith, and he calls it the abortion myth.
Yeah.
Because as he shows, it's not really their key issue. Their key issue is racism. But
Absolutely.
racism, after the civil rights movement, it doesn't play as well. So they're not using the N-word so much, and they're not being so explicitly racist. But underneath, it's racism that's driving. Next slide. So, for example, Jerry Falwell was opposed to the civil rights, opposed to Dr. King. The Civil Rights Act he called civil wrongs. Right, next slide. And so,
Yep.
one of the things that happened was, Liberty Academy, Bob Jones University were segregated. There were segregated schools in this county in Mississippi, so that they had 3 Christian academies, which were all white, and the public schools were all black. Right, next slide. So this is really what got to them. There were these court cases where the IRS went after those Christian academies in Mississippi and said, because you are segregated, you cannot claim IRS tax exemption, so you're gonna have to pay taxes. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court affirmed the decision, right? So that really got them mad. And then Bob Jones University, because it was segregated, loses its tax exempt status. And so that really influenced things. Next. And then a key turning point is the evangelicals supporting Reagan in 1980. Remember, they had mostly supported Carter in 1976, but they switched. And I mean, Reagan, there's a lot of racism in Reagan, right? When he was governor of California, he was opposed to the Civil Rights Acts. He calls for law and order. And law and order, that language is a dog whistle for racism. They're saying, we gotta have law and order in the cities where the African Americans are.
Where's war on drugs on here? I don't see
Right,
that.
yeah, it's not on there, but it should be, yeah,
Shit that comes with.
right. Okay, next slide. So, the racist element is undeniable. And so it's important to name it as white Christian nationalism. And, you know, it can take these horrific forms when Dylan Roof slaughtered people at Mother Emanuel. And for when I presented in my ELCA congregations, I needed to point out that he was on the rolls of the ELCA congregation. To our shame. Next slide. And so January 6th is an expression of white Christian nationalism. There were a lot of white Christian nationalists in the crowd that day. And of course, they promoted the idea of election fraud. And again, this, you know, strong outrage against government incursion, personal lives. Okay, next slide. Okay, so here's the third kind of theory. Marriage of money, media, and religion. So in 1980, Ronald Reagan spoke to a gathering of fundamentalist leaders in Dallas. And he was told ahead of time, now this is a nonpartisan crowd, so they can't endorse you officially. And so, I mean, this, again, this is really brilliant. So what does he say? I know this is a nonpartisan group and you can't endorse me, but I endorse you and what you're doing. And so this gathering was really crucial in swinging fundamentalist support to Reagan in 1980. Okay, next slide. So a key person behind the scenes in all this, a political operative, is a guy by the name of Paul Weyrich. And he is a Republican operative, the kind of Republican that, you know, wants a right-wing republicanism and not kind of traditional, just conservative republicanism. But he's also works with the fundamentalist leaders. So part of what he does is found these important organizations. One of them is the Heritage Foundation. And the money comes in here because he was able to get major backing from some really rich people to get these organizations going. The other thing about these folks is they've been really smart in playing the long. They set up organizations and they worked them, and they worked for the long game, and they had, unfortunately, a lot of success. Next slide. Among the organizations, the Republican Study Committee that works with Congress, very important, the American Legislative Exchange Council. How many of you have heard of that?
Alec.
Not many. Really important. Thank you, Richard. You get a gold star. They work on state issues. So they bring folks together. They craft legislation for states, and then they push it in one state, and they see if it works. They see what the resistance is to it, if it passes legal muster, and they just support each other and you know, go after education or go after social welfare programs. So really important on the state level. And Weyrich is the one who provided the name of moral majority. What a really smart brand, right? Next slide. But most importantly, the organization is this Council for National Policy. How many of you have heard of that? I had it a year ago. Really important. It's a secretive organization of millionaires and billionaires and conservative political and religious leaders. And they wield a lot of influence. Most of it that flies under the radar. But where they come together, the fundamentalist leaders and the wealthy folks is they want to oppose income tax and they want to oppose government regulation and oppose social safety nets. Right, so you can see they're winning the day today. Next slide. Now another thing about media is there's these three radio networks. I mean, if you had that experience of driving somewhere in a rural area and turning on the radio and find one fundamentalist preacher after another, that's part of this network that they have. And that's the, that's the media that influences a lot of people, especially, not only, but especially in the rural areas. And they promote, fundamentalist Christianity and conservative politics. And of course, also, Fox and Breitbart
Right.
and social media. So, yeah, next slide. Okay, so what do? We need to be church the way we are called to be church. We need to build our communities, build community inside and outside of the church. And, these things, but just to put them out there. Affirm the importance of science. Acknowledge the reality of climate change. Affirm and oppose the reality of racism and sexism and homophobia. Affirm the equality of men and women. We probably take that for granted, but you need to keep working at that because it's really important. And recognize that LGBTQIA people are us. And there's not much to put up there to respond to all this, but I had to close with something.
Thank you. So very seldomly do people do that, yeah.
So what, let's have some conversation, questions, comments. Nancy Howell.
Okay, I think you debunked some stereotypes of white Christian nationalism, intelligence issues are one.
Yeah.
Well, could you analyze further the demographics that connect with white Christian nationalism, because I might be wrong? And how the experience of that demographic makes white Christian nationalism feel right to them?
Yeah, I'd have to look, Nancy. I'm not sure exactly how the demographics shake out, but I do think that that sense of grievance is really important. David Brooks' analysis is always that the elitists are out of touch with common people, working people. And so, we don't connect with them. And so there is that sense of, I think the important thing is that sense of, the way we lifted up equality and recognition of non-white people. It's just, they feel like they've been standing in line and now these people have been allowed to cut in front of them.
Right,
That's the way they feel.
that's scarcity
And
culture.
I think that's what plays. So Trump's played on that sense of grievance. I think that's, Dr. Aft.
I don't understand, unless it was just, I don't understand how the evangelicals and white Christian nationalists linked up with Trump, because he was not in that category. Was it simply that he was malleable, that he was willing to be supported by them, or was there something else?
In 2016, their guy initially was Cruz. Thank you.
Right.
Cruz's father is a fundamentalist preacher, right?
Yeah.
And so when Trump beat Cruz in Iowa, right? Didn't he? I think so. Then they turned to Trump, and part of Gorski and Whitehead, part of their argument is that there's ways in which fundamentalism has been somewhat secularized. the emphasis on
Right.
the
But
traditional.
he doesn't know his Bible.
Right.
Yeah.
He doesn't,
Right.
right.
No,
But
He
but
can't-
also they argue there are kind of
But I mean,
secular
that's
versions
that's the thing.
of white Christian nationalism that are parallel, so they can make common cause with them.
Okay.
So, and then, right, they also have this theory that, yeah, Trump's a bad guy, but God's using him.
Yeah,
Mhm.
but
That's
because he'll
another-
do what we want.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, and he's doing what God. wants.
Yeah.
In
I
some
I
ways.
think there's also an extent to which um the fundamentalists in our country believe that the myth of rugged individualism and those types of ideas and free market capitalism is Christianity.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
they don't need to see anything more Christian to say that, oh, this is Christian.
It embodies that.
That's right.
My question for you,
That's really good, Richard.
if I may, just to piggybacks eloquently or elegantly, I think. My curiosity is, this seems to like reek of prosperity gospel. And I'm asking my professor of religious history, so I should know the answer to this. I feel really bad for asking this in this space. But I'm curious which came first. Like, did prosperity gospel emerge out of this evangelical tradition of kind of bootstrapping? Or was there a tradition that these folks reached back to and this Christology that said Jesus is my friend and not someone who is an enemy of the state? You know, Jesus for the people versus Jesus for me.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm having trouble following the historical line. I get the cultural line, but I'm having trouble following the historical line when that would have been adopted. It
Yeah.
seems almost unconsciously as their model of Christianity, which, as you said, is kind of a modern view, ironically.
It is. I'm blanking on some important things. Norman Vincent Peale, what do we call that? That's not prosperity.
Positive.
Yeah.
Positive thinking, so that's kind of a precursor to prosperity gospel.
Right.
And so then those kind of themes get taken up by more explicitly, because Peele's not as explicitly Christian, right? But others are. Who's the guy, Schuler, was he the guy in California?
Mhm.
Robert Schuler. I'd have to think more about the kind of historical connections on that. I'm not altogether sure, but if we talk about positive thinking as part of one of the roots of prosperity gospel, that's coming also earlier.
Historically, about what was that?
Well,
early
20s,
20th century? Okay.
50s, yeah.
Thank you.
But given our time frame, oh my goodness, we have a lot, so much. I was wondering if, Dr. Brandt, if you would be available to talk with people after over lunch or something else.
Well, I have an important job over lunch.
Yeah.
To be the docent.
Oh, that's right.
But
Oh,
maybe
that's
I
right.
can do more than one.
Okay, all right, thank you. And please, but I think if we could get, maybe if there's somebody online that would have a question or in Oklahoma,
Yes, we have one in Oklahoma.
yeah, we could.
I just was a little bit curious about the statement that we take the equality of men and women for granted. And I just asked that because having been a woman for quite a while in conservative states, I have not felt that was taken for granted since about elementary school. And actually, I feel like in the past decade or so, I have felt that much more strongly than I did even in my younger years. So I am very much in agreement with you of the importance of putting that white onto the Christian nationalism, but I would be interested to see that become white male Christian nationalism, because I do think that is a very central point to Project 2025 and the current Christian nationalism.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Look
And
at that a lot.
and saying that we take it for granted is bad in that it kind of overlooks or discounts all the negative experiences you've had, and I don't want to do that. So thank you for thank you for lifting that.
I didn't mean that as a criticism, just as a,
No, it's
It's
a really good point.
It's a great point.
Because and I didn't lift up the patriarchal character and the heteronormativity character of white Christian nationalism, which is right up there. It's really, really central.
Oh my gosh, wow. Yes.
Look, finally, I appreciated your characterization of Billy Graham. I mean, he was a decent guy, and he's also in our window at the Church of the Resurrection, along with Martin Luther King
Yeah.
and Rosa Parks. But I grew up with going to, of course, all of his
Crusades.
Yeah.
crusades. Thank you.
Yeah.
And my fear when I was a little girl was of hippies and the motorcycle gang that was going on, and they would go and they'd interrupt his crusades. But he's unfortunately was the start of evangelicalism. And,
Yeah.
And
Okay,
one
I'm
church-
gonna speak on behalf of the marginalized, because Rachel had her hand up so long ago, she no longer has circulation.
So I just wanted to, one response.
I gotta preach today, I'm Dr. Elaine Martin.
Oh.
White male Christian nationalism. If that's gonna be the case, then white women need to start voting with their morality and their stance on that, because 69% of white women voted for Trump.
Yeah.
There was a recent, like, not scientific, whatever, poll that was posted on, it was on the United Methodist Clergy Facebook page, but it said 60% of United Methodists voted for Trump post disaffiliation. Other Methodists, which would include
Interesting.
the other ones, was only 68%. So one, we're stuck, white ladies, we're stuck with Christian nationalism being what it is until we decide to not contribute to it. And then also like I am in a rural context, and most of the people, I would be in whoever voted for not Donald Trump is in the broad minority in my context. And there's a certain amount of dissonance between mission mindset, grasp of the gospel, living it out, and the political sphere. And I think we, as pastors, have done ourselves a gross disservice staying bland.
Yes.
I am preaching in context where it is the evangelical fundamentalist pastor on the radio. And they come and they wonder why I'm not passionate about what I'm saying. Which they haven't said that, but it's a different context. And to say like, oh, these people, well, those are my people.
Right.
That's my ministry. That's who I'm in ministry with and love dearly. It's not them,
Right.
right? So.
Yeah, the other end that's going.
Ooh-wee.
Thank
All
you,
right,
Dr.
the
Grant.
richness, the richness. Wow. There is a QR code. If you would scan that QR code and take that little feedback, we would really appreciate it for our series of forums, just to hear from you all. That QR code, we appreciate it to hear from you. All right, thank you all, Dr. Brandt, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our last forum of the year. Wow.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
That was really. Oh, dear me.
I really don't know, but it is a thing.
But we take it, that's why it's coming up now.
It's my first experience and I'm just like.
Nice.
I feel like my heart.
Yeah.
I didn't take any notes
It's a way of coping.
Well, for some, yeah. But I think.